Welcome to our Zession. If you're new here, my name is Mandi Rourke.
And I'm Sapna Srivastav.
And if you've never been to a Zession before, just a quick explanation. Zessions are conversations amongst clinicians about topics, mental health topics that we would typically cover in a therapy session, more or less.
As marriage and family therapists ourselves, we talk about topics that typically we would address in therapy sessions and ideally offer the perspectives of clinicians. Today, it's us as clinicians and ways that we can support clients daily.
Definitely. Today, our topic is black and white thinking. We really hope that this will be a helpful one and that you'll be able to walk away with maybe some new perspectives and also a little bit of insight into like what this means and how do we know it exists and what do we do once we know that. So why do you think this is such an important topic, black and white thinking, for us to discuss?
Yeah, I think it's really prevalent for a lot of people, especially in particular thinking about American culture and society today, especially within the last few years, I would say. It's become a lot easier, or we've been challenged a lot more given the pandemic to stop doing that. But it's really a very common thing that we all fall into that's not always the most helpful and can really start to create a lot of rigidity and a lot of anxiety and just kind of can contribute to a lot more of the mental health issues that we're often encountering. What would you say?
I think black and white thinking can affect people on an individual level, and definitely in my perspective as a couples therapist, I see it happening or impacting relationships a ton too. Maybe first we start with defining what black and white thinking is. There's a lot of different ways of thinking of it. There's black and white thinking. There's all or nothing thinking. There is splitting. What else would we say? I mean, it's essentially a cognitive distortion where it's this exaggerated pattern of thinking that it's either all good or all bad or it's right or it's wrong, this either or type of mentality. Would you agree, or how else would you define that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it just that way of we kind of almost put things into one of two categories and there's really no other option, essentially. And so it can be really pigeonholing in a lot of ways, but it's often, something that we do pretty automatically and we don't really recognize it necessarily. And it's something that, again, society often tends to make us think that is necessary in a lot of ways. I think our society often tends to put things into categories as well. So it's really easy for us to get into that habit individually, as well as, like you said, in our relationships too.
I think going back to society, to jump to that, I mean, we either vote for something, we vote against something, or the light is either on or it is off, or you stop or you go. It's very just divided and you have two options. And so we're just accustomed to thinking in that way. So it's not that we're walking towards discomfort, but we're naturally kind of placed in it if we only have really two options to consider. It's either black or white, good or bad. We're split in between two. And we really want to challenge that today, I would say, of like, how do we be in this space between, even though everything around us almost tells us you're not supposed to be in the gray.
Yeah. It's really almost counterintuitive to go towards the gray, and really takes a lot of intentionality and recognition. Like even just in training to become a clinician, that's part of the process, right? Is learning to like recognize the gray, sit in the gray. And by the gray, I mean like the multitude of other options other than this black one option or white two option. And so I think and it still remains a continual practice that we have to be really intentional about, but it's really, really challenging to get to that space when we've kind of been socialized and trained. This is the way it is. This is what's normal. And this is what's safe and easiest for our brains to think about too.
Well, and I think around the lens of safety too, if someone has experienced trauma in the past, it could be a very natural reaction to have this either good or bad or good or evil type of thinking, because there's been a belief that has come out of this experience that it's like, these are my safeguards. If I can be very clear around this is bad or this is good or this is safe or this is unsafe, that can help me maybe feel safe. While at the same time, it kind of puts you in that binded thought, maybe is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate that you bring that up, because I think that is like a helpful functionality of Black and white thinking at its core, of keeping you safe. If I categorize things into one or another, I know which is which. I feel a lot more firm-footed in moving forward, and there's a lot less uncertainty. I know what to protect myself from versus what's safe. And it can be really adaptive in that way, in particular if someone has experienced trauma, like you mentioned. It can be a way of continuing to protect yourself very easily. It's when that gets applied to every scenario, or more scenarios than just unsafe ones, when that starts to become a more of an issue that can lead into bigger issues oftentimes.
It's almost like all or nothing thinking all of the time. But maybe we want to get into the practice of choosing when it may be helpful.
Yeah.
And maybe when it is more harmful or limiting.
Yeah, getting meta there with choosing the gray areas in which all nothing thinking is not the most helpful. But yeah, being really intentional, or getting to the place, and it's way easier said than done, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience, but eventually getting to that place where you can start to recognize, is this a helpful instance in which to utilize Black and white thinking? Or is this a scenario where this is being more harmful than helpful, or just unhelpful?
I think within this too, it'd be important. I mean, you already mentioned about American culture and that being impressed upon us too. And I think about just other cultural norms or expectations, or even traditions of like, this is the way that we live, or these are our norms. And I think that sometimes people can get really like kind of jolted on like, if I don't choose this way, then that means I am a failure to my family, or I am a disappointment as a whole because I'm seeing something different. And maybe it feels like this extreme difference, and maybe it isn't, but it could feel that way, and it could be perceived that way as well if there is this very split way of like, you either do it this way or you're doing it the way that like you shouldn't do.
Yeah, I am kind of thinking about both my own experience as well as the experience of many clients that I work with who are kind of like first, second generation in the States, but coming from, parents who are immigrants who are trying to balance both cultural norms from their family's culture as well as cultural norms here where they're living and being raised and growing up and, integrating into society. And it can be really, really hard to feel like you have to adhere to one or the other. Whereas that gray area would be like, where can I combine both? Or where can I choose, like, this is one helpful aspect from my family's culture, whereas this is another one from the culture that I've been raised in that really resonates with me, and kind of choose what culture looks like for you. That could be like an example, too, of what you're saying of, in a different way a little bit, but another example of utilizing culture and how Black and white thinking can kind of apply to it, as well as recognizing like the grays are the ones that you can choose rather than feeling the pressure to adhere to one or the other. And so that pressure can even be like an indicator of like, okay, am I falling into the trap of thinking I have to be one way or another? If in order to be enough, in order to be good enough, or be what's expected of me in some way or other.
And I wonder too, I mean, how different or what the different beliefs are out there around kind of sitting in the gray. Because I definitely have some clients who are like, I am all or nothing. I'm either in or I'm out. And it's something that almost like feels like an inherent part of them. And it's maybe even a strength of them. You know, like I am such a strong worker and I expect perfectionism. And this is just the way that it's going to be. I think can be really just interesting to kind of consider what do people, or how do people perceive what it means to be in the gray? Is it threatening? Is it unsafe again? Is it, what's the right way to describe this? Like going, like, is it intentionally like pushing away from, or is it just allowing space for more?
Yeah, that's a great question. And even you bringing that up kind of reminded me of like a very common phrase that you tend to hear of like, it's either a hell yes or a hell nah. And very, very black and white thinking, not always necessarily like a bad thing, but often, you know, not always the only options that are available to us. And so, but it does feel more comfortable to be able to be like, if it's not a hell yes, then the rest are not viable options, and we move. And it's, you know, it can be kind of rejecting that, to go back to your question, like, what does it mean for many people to sit in the gray? It's, I don't know that I have an answer to that, because it can be so subjective based on kind of generation, even culture, you know, what you've been raised with in your own family. It's often taught in your own families too, of like, this is the one way of doing it, kind of like the cultural piece too, but kind of narrowing that into just the family system. For us as marriage and family therapists, we think in that way. If we're thinking of the family as its own small little culture, it can be taught in that way. And so even going towards the gray can feel hella scary.
Uncomfortable. Yeah.
Super.
Discomfort keeps coming up as you're describing this, of like, if I have been almost like conditioned, or there's been ingrained beliefs that like, this is the way we do it, or this way, it's this either or mentality, then it does get a little just tricky. I think one thing that, as I'm saying this, it comes up of like politics and religion. Like people don't want to talk about that. That's the, like, don't bring it up, because it's like, there's this emphasis of like, if you don't agree, then you're either right or you're wrong. And now all of a sudden it just leaves people in this place of almost like it can be combative, of just such extreme different versions of what we're thinking. But that's how I see it play out so much in a lot of the family therapy that I support my clients in, or even relational therapy, of, you know, having to avoid certain topics because they're not in perfect alignment, or we have friends that align perfectly with our values and the friends that don't, they're out. And it's like, oof, like it starts getting into this labeling again of like this bad and this good, or like you're for the same religion or the wrong, political party or whatever it might be. And there's so many more layers to that, but those layers are the gray, and those layers, I do think, like you were saying, it's super scary, but also it's like, what, like how? How do I sit there and leave space for that? I think we can say hold space, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah, good question. Well, and before we kind of dive into that more, even in just that example, from my perspective, like as a woman of color too, I recognize oftentimes that black and white thinking of, you know, one political camp or another, for me personally, can be a safety, an assessment of safety. And so for me, I do think I often tend to easily ascribe black and white thinking in those circumstances just out of is this a safe person or not? And so, and I mean, but there's also still so much more nuance too. But
in that case, that could be helpful, like we were talking about before, where it's not, again, all bad.
Right, exactly. And there can be more room too for recognizing like, okay, they still might be a safe person, even if they don't fall into this category that feels more comfortable. We don't know. And so I mean, I'm not encouraging necessarily people putting themselves in situations to figure out safety just for the sake of it, but just acknowledging that there is another scenario out there. And then to come back to your original question of how do we hold space? What does that mean even for the gray? I think it is just kind of giving yourself a beat oftentimes. I think we usually, our brains often use black and white thinking to make things both safer and more efficient. And so it doesn't have to use as much energy to consider all the gray. If you are just looking at pictures or movies or what have you in black and white, there's a lot less nuance that you have to consider, and it's easier to just keep moving forward. Versus if there's a lot more gray, then there's a lot more to consider, there's a lot more to think about. It can slow us down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not always to what our brain wants or what society says is okay for us to do. And so I think in sitting with that gray, it could mean like taking a beat, giving yourself a little extra wiggle room to consider these other options, and making space for that can look different for different people. It could mean like being very intentional about saving some space at some point in your day to be like, okay, I found myself falling into black and white thinking here. What are the other options that are available to me? Or it could be in the moment, like, take a breath. This feels uncomfortable. What's going on here?
And I think that's something within therapy. It's a big part of our process of being able to identify when are you maybe slipping into that line of thinking, because as we've been describing this whole time, I think on and off, can't help myself, is that there is this just there, like you're either in it or you're not. And I think that as a person, as you're listening to this, it's like, well, how would I know that I'm falling into that trap? And I think within therapy, that is part of my job, is to listen to individuals or even couples and in the way that they're talking about their problems or about their experience. And when there's this very fixed mindset, or maybe it's just like, this is bad, or my experience is bad, or in relationships, this happens so often where it's, this person is the problem. I am not, which is, again, it puts this into, that is maybe what naturally is that's how you naturally think. But also, what if there's more to that? What if there is more in this space of like, maybe there was a very bad argument that you got into and you felt that this person was being mean. But when you find yourself, or when I hear, couples or individuals going away with these grand kind of definitions about themselves or about others, that's when I'm like, whoops, let's time out for just a second. Let's dive into that a little bit more. Let's challenge that thought maybe a little bit more. And I think that's what you're also kind of alluding to. Like, let's take a beat for a second. Let's understand if it has to be one or the other, or if it doesn't, which I think it doesn't, where do we find that in between of maybe this person just had a really, really bad moment and there were some really harsh words being spoken, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this person is the problem. It means that there was a problem, and let's get more facts to the case, essentially, before we jump into any of those assumptions or like defining who someone is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yourself included, right? Like, I am a failure or I am amazing.
Right. Like putting these broad labels on someone, including yourself, like you just said, can be another indicator of splitting, of they never care about me, or I always do this wrong, or anything along those lines. If you're doing kind of that all or nothing, then that can be an indication that you're kind of falling into that trap. Because rarely ever is it always one way or another. Or is there only one problem that's contributing to a situation? Usually there's multiple things going on and multiple ways that those factors are kind of feeding in. So in our example here, if it's a couple, usually there's more than one interaction that's kind of contributing to the problem rather than this one person being the sole cause. Sometimes it can happen, but very rarely is that always the case. Usually it's more than one thing, but it can be really hard to get to that place if I know I'm going to feel like crap about myself, if I even start to acknowledge that I could be playing a role in this problem with my partner. It feels a lot more comfortable for me to just say, like, he's the problem, or she's the problem, or they're the problem. And then I protect myself in that way, and my own feelings about myself and who I am, how I define myself in that way, and feel like I feel justified in protecting myself from them, which again, in some circumstances, very likely to be justified, but not always.
Just for the emotional safety,
Yeah.
again, where it's like it could be helpful, depending.
Yeah.
But also it's starting to ask yourself, or I think as the clinician, going back to that of just expanding it a little bit.
Yeah.
You're trying to.
Yeah, exactly. And then I also would apply a lot of that outside of just couple relationships too, of, you know, if we are just thinking about everyday situations that we encounter, if we think of it's just this one thing that's the cause of the problem, often that can be a main contributor, but it's not usually always just that one thing that might be the best entry point to kind of solving something. For example, you know, I can't get up on time, so I just need to make sure I stick to a bedtime. But what else is going around that's contributing to me not being able to stick to bedtime? I may or may not be speaking from personal experience. We can ignore that.
Well, within that too, I think about this within, I'm getting very like systems of all the different systems that are interconnected or intertwined with one another. And I was thinking about a conversation with another mom yesterday that was saying how basically the teacher was like, what's going on with your kid? Your kid is the kind of, you know, the problem child, if you will. And it felt very like bad versus like bad kid versus good kid. And the reality is the conversation got so focused on just this child, which happened. I mean, that happens a ton in family therapy too, where like if a kid is acting out, it's like, okay, what's going on with the kid? And our job as clinicians is to, okay, we can hear that that's what your experience is and that you feel that there is something bad here and that it's not, it's almost like a failure versus like a success of this behavior. But then if we broaden the conversation out to include all of the different, like you said, this is an entry point of the conversation. But then as we talk about, okay, what's happening at school? What happened in the soccer game? What happened over at their friend's house? Or what's happening within the home? Let's get all the supporting information, all those nuances, right? All those layers to help really inform what's really at play here versus this is just a snap assumption. This is what's happening. And let's just, and maybe part of that is like, I think you were kind of alluding to this earlier, just this fast, like, it's almost like this efficient way of solving a problem. It's, this is the way. Okay, let's move on.
Yes.
But I think it can speak for both of us that we find ourselves maybe being like, and also, what else could we consider as part of what's happening here? And that's kind of our goal as we start bridging ourselves from black or white thinking into being in this space of gray.
Yeah. And I also do want to name too, like this is also part of what I was alluding to earlier, in that we have had extensive training at this point in learning to recognize the gray, the nuance, the different options of what else could be contributing to any particular problem. And I want to recognize that is not a common thing for people to be trained in. And so very, very, very difficult for a lot of people to get to on their own, or even to start working through with the support of a professional even. And so within the process, I also want to name like having the utmost patience and grace for yourself in starting to challenge that, because it can be scary AF.
Yeah.
To start thinking of those things, especially, again, I think so often it comes back to like, not always, obviously. Yeah, that wasn't even on purpose, guys. Not always, but it can often come back to feeling like this can impact how I see myself and how others see myself. And if that's feeling pretty fragile, oftentimes, then it can be really hard for us to push ourselves to acknowledge other scenarios.
And I think that's what brings in kind of the next part of the conversation is how do we support clients in this process? And I think you're starting to get to the first part of this is take time and be patient and also maybe try to slow down too, because we are so, not all of us are so fast, but there is, at least in my work with a lot of the clients that I support, it's like, I need to have this like rapid way of navigating the world, and I should be able to move through all of this very quickly. And I just don't think that that's necessarily possible all the time. And I think to what you're describing too, it feels very unfamiliar. It feels very scary. And to me, that means it's like you're stretching. This is a new skill, and it's expected that it'll feel uncomfortable. And then after you keep doing something, it's almost like a habit of thought. You continue to reinforce this new way of kind of, okay, I have these two options. What could be the one in between? What would that look like? And starting to have with our clients these conversations around curiosity of if they're very specific around it's either this or this, you're like, what else? And so that can be almost this practice of, and I think even as we were starting to prep through this, like having thought logs or feeling logs about your day-to-day experience, and that's more of a tip, and how we would work with a client, but to get more into this place of observation around, what is your typical thought pattern, and do you tend to give yourself only, choose from A or B, is it true or false, or do you have multiple choice options is kind of the aim here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even the slowing down piece, and again, I don't know if we've mentioned that there might be nuance, but I think there really can be so many reasons why even just that much of feeling like I need to slow down, but that feels really uncomfortable for me to slow down, can also be like a really tough starting point to get to. So again, that's where the patience comes in, and kind of the intentionality as well. And also, like, as you're saying, I love the thought log. I think that's perfect. I think that's a really intentional way of starting to think about and observe when we're falling into those patterns. But even if you're not able to quite get to that thought log, I'm thinking of, many, many scenarios, including parents. It's really hard to just sit down and like write out your thoughts, especially if you have, young ones trying to take up all the space of your thoughts. So even just starting to recognize moments, even if you're just looking back of like, I was being pretty rigid there, or I felt a lot of pressure there, or I was really reactive in that moment. And by reactive, I mean like I made a snap judgment, or I snapped at someone. And those can be instances and invitations in which you can start to recognize, okay, was there a little black and white thinking? Was there a little splitting going on there? Was I really adhering to one option when I was ignoring kind of some of these others that could be possible? Those can be beginning indicators, and just recognizing those instances can be a very, very small, very first step that I personally always encourage, the baby steps.
Yep.
As much as possible, or multiple baby steps.
Probably multiple. And I think that just physiologically speaking in our bodies, one way, that first baby step is to notice what you're feeling in your body first, because as you were just describing that, I almost like found myself feeling like this, okay, you're going to know when you start like clenching up, there's like this pressure of like kind of, as I was describing earlier, like I'm kind of trapped almost between it's this or this, and you kind of feel yourself. And I think just start noticing your body first, and then maybe the next little baby step is start to take care of that first by breath work of just nostril breathing in your nose, out your nose, to be like, okay, I notice that there's a pressure point here.
Yeah.
And then build off of that. What is behind that physical sensation that I'm experiencing? And maybe it has something to do with all or nothing thinking. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's somewhere in between. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of jumping back to the thought log, I think that's also a really great opportunity as we start to practice working through recognizing these instances of black and white thinking, and kind of calming our bodies down as we recognize our reactions to it and kind of the friction it could be causing oftentimes. The thought log could be one instance, one way, an opportunity in which we can be intentional about starting to think about what the gray could look like. Or so it could be just holding these two opposing issues together as both possibilities could be a great first step to considering the gray. Also just recognizing what are the other multitude of scenarios. So like if it feels like my partner is being really rude to me, and I find myself thinking like they have been rude to me consistently for a long time now and just labeling them as rude, what else could be going on for them? And I want to balance that with like, we don't have to overly justify, but in these circumstances, when we are labeling, it could be helpful to start thinking about, okay, they're probably really stressed with work. We have a new kid in the house. They're probably really stressed with balancing work and being sleep deprived, as we both are, and, you know, maybe feeling like they're a competent parent. There's a lot that can be considered. And so maybe giving yourself the time and space to start considering that can be a next step, a more advanced step, if you will. But for those ready, able, and willing to get there, when they're able, ready, and willing to get there, could be an option.
You know, as you were saying that too, it is something like further in the process, because, you know, the first step is just starting to gain awareness, which if this is something that has been very natural for a long period of time, that's, again, it's like a new, like you're training yourself to kind of start exploring another way. And I think we're talking a lot about thinking here, but part of this thought log or just curiosity about your experience, I think ties in with feelings too. And I've definitely, I mean, I think of this song like happy and sad at the same time. And I love it so much because I think that it really does encompass what we're looking at here of how do you blend these experiences where, and I feel it so viscerally too. Like I can feel so happy and also equally sad and also maybe somewhere in between, like confused, like how am I able to feel all of these things all at once? And so I think it can offer a little bit of freedom to some extent when you think about just the way that you feel about yourself and the way that you feel with others, to know that you have more options. It might not be readily accessible, but you can work towards it becoming more accessible to figure out, you know, the multiple choice options or the multiple layers of thinking about, you know, yourself or how a partner may be interacting in the world or with themselves or with others or whatever it may be. But one thing I just have to say as we're saying this is that there's no right or wrong way of doing this.
Yeah,
there really isn't. There's just trying to think about it and consider what could happen.
Yeah, agreed. There's, again, so much nuance, and there really isn't. I mean, it's take what's helpful to you and leave the rest in this scenario. And as you were just saying that, really reminded me of Inside Out, and like. Slight spoilers, if you haven't watched it, you have to watch it. It is so good. And so eventually we get to the point of recognizing like joy and sadness can be in the same space together in our bodies. Anger and fear usually are working in harmony oftentimes, but that can also be coupled with joy. And, you know, that does offer us far more options. And there is no right or wrong way to go about this. It's at your pace. It is at the context and the level that is helpful for you, what looks like progress for you, may look very different to what looks like progress for another person. That can include your partner or your parent or anyone else that you have a relationship with. So just being very patient and knowing that you can hold patience and impatience at the same time.
Almost make it, I mean, as we're laughing about it, it can be something to just experiment with, see if you, I can think of the day, the story of driving to work and you spill your coffee all over yourself, you have a flat tire. That's kind of a rough start to the day. And it could be very easy to say like, this is a bad day, period. But then that can also just be this blanket statement of your entire experience. And I'm saying that in like a very like daily type of encounter, but that can also happen on the scale of like, I had a bad day. Now I'm having a bad week. Now I'm having a bad month. This has been a really bad year. And so maybe it's just listening also for that absolutist type of always, never types of words that come out too and be like, oh, oops, interesting. Yeah, I'm not doing it bad. I'm not doing it good. I'm just noticing that is kind of what my natural way of relating to myself for this experience is. And that's okay. Yeah. You'll figure it out.
Yeah. I like that. I think that coupled with another point that I want to reemphasize is also when you start to recognize those instances of that absolutist thinking, or maybe some of the black and white thinking creeping up, making sure you're asking yourself too, like, is this a helpful instance to be utilized? Is this helpful for the black and white thinking to be protecting me in this moment? And is the thing that I think I need protecting from a real threat or not? Because oftentimes, especially when trauma is involved, it can label scenarios. There can be multiple layers of the black and white thinking and feeling and reacting. And so sometimes things that feel very similar as a threat may not necessarily actually be a real threat. And to really work through that, I would highly recommend working with a professional within that regard to start working through that. But recognizing too, there are instances where this is going to be helpful and this is going to be protective. But those instances are probably going to be a lot fewer and far between if we really start to work on understanding what we need protecting from.
I think that's just an extra necessary reinforcement. And within that, or in addition to that, I think it would be good just for there to be just a kind of a scanning with your experience to wonder if I tend to feel very anxious or very fearful or just in this like self-critical state, whether that be about myself or others. I think that can also be a good compass to talk to someone about that and get some additional perspectives, because, as we're describing this, we're kind of talking about this through the lens of, more self-awareness and internal dialogue and self-reflection and everything. But sometimes if, those two options are the first ones that are readily available, we do need to bring in other voices to consider, like, oh, have you thought about that? I mean, it's just what we do when we're trying to problem solve. We call a friend or we call a family member to ask for other perspectives. And I think maybe it's important to notice those times when you are doing that too, versus the times when you feel like you are slipping into all or nothing, that there are some exceptions to that too, of like, you do look for other perspectives, and that's your way of just kind of expanding your own experience and giving yourself more options, really.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than having to start from scratch yourself, and your support system is always going to be something that we emphasize as is important, whether it is a loved one, a friend, or even a professional, of what are the other options here, or even just asking your partner if you feel safe enough, like, hey, I find myself making this assumption about you. What's going on for you? And kind of slowing it down even that much and getting their perspective, perhaps when there's a little more calmness involved.
Yes, right.
But absolutely, I love that.
I feel like we could talk about splitting all day forever. But I think that this is probably a good stopping point to just let this marinate with anyone who's listening and be kind of what you're saying before, this entry point of curiosity as far as like how you're talking to yourself, how you're thinking to yourself, how you're thinking about others and the world that surrounds you, and just see, you know, where are some of those gray areas that we can lean into. And, you know, ultimately Zession, we are here to help support you in this community too, and point you to clinicians that can support you along the way. And also just, of course, keep us updated with any kind of feedback that you have and or questions that you would want us to have any other, you know, future conversations on, or even presentations to kind of follow up with some more of the specifics around this, because as we've been mentioning today, not everyone does it, but a lot of people do.
Yeah, exactly. So feel free, if you feel so inclined, if you have additional questions, find us on Instagram at myzessio, as Mandi mentioned earlier, and just shoot us a DM, and we are more than happy to engage with y'all around this topic and any others that you're interested in. Awesome. And appreciate y'all joining us.
Yes, we're grateful that you're here with us today.